So today we talk about the way of water. So in Confucian texts there's much mention of nature, and in a way nature is taken as a model. There is a sense in which there is a kind of intimacy with nature, as if it is clearly understood and embraced. At the same time, there's much talk about managing nature, the need to construct canals and waterways, the need to plant mulberry trees to generate silk, as silk is particularly needed by the elderly, and so on. So there's a little bit of the management of nature, as well as the sense that we need to be taught by nature, and that we need to be able to learn its lessons. There is no sense in which nature becomes a false god, as in the West, leading to a degree of idolatry and nature worship. But the willingness to cooperate and the sensitivity towards the working of nature is there. There is the same concern for harmony as there is in the social sphere. Harmony between humans and nature, in this case. In the West, we swing between two poles: the idolatry of nature, nature worship on one side, with the other pole being the severe over-management of nature, where we try to make it fit our needs perfectly, so that nature becomes a victim of human hubris. And so to water. At this point I introduce the name of Mencius, or Mengji, who was a later philosopher in the school of Confucius. He wrote in the 4th century BC, towards the end of it. He is regarded as the second most prominent philosopher in the Confucian school after Confucius himself, and became well known in the West under the name of Mencius, which is a Latinized form of his Chinese name, which made his name more accessible in the West at the time. Mencius is in some ways easier to read, and he says more, which makes it easier as well, because Confucius' sayings are cryptic and difficult. This said, it is this very feature which makes you think harder in the case of Confucius. So the lucidity of Mencius may not entirely be a bonus. Mencius preserves a saying about Confucius in which he makes an exclamation about the wonder of water. Water are water. There is a whole story behind this which involves a reverence for water and the way in which it moves, and is indicative of a willingness to be taught by water, as well as other forms of nature. Water is not just a metaphor in the Confucian tradition. It is a reality on which ideas are built, and human nature springs from it. Mencius tells a creation story from long ago, similar to the flood story of the book of Genesis in the Bible, but of course in many ways entirely different. He says that the world was generated long ago, and that there was a time of order, then a time of disorder, at the time of Yao, when water inundated the central states, and snakes and dragons lived in it. The people had nowhere to settle, but they made their dwellings as best they could. There was water everywhere, but then Yu began to control it. He excavated the earth and made channels in the direction of the sea, and drove away the snakes and dragons. the water proceeded along these courses into the sea, and then people obtained level land to live on, and there was less danger to them from birds and beasts. So the myth of origin, which shapes the thinking here, has water being initially dominant, but at last being controlled by human agency, then using the human-built channels into the sea. But this does not give rise to any sense that water is an enemy to be managed by a domineering human presence. On the contrary, lessons are learned from it. In a sense, water is managed by human beings learning its lessons and not by confronting it as an enemy. Humans learn its lessons. Water moves downward, and it is for this reason that it can be channeled and that it will flow in the direction which is planned on the basis of this observed downward movement. It can move itself without being moved by something else, or so it appeared. And this fact was a source of great fascination. It's worth noting that the question of how motion acted, how it began, what started it, and how it ended, was also a great preoccupation of the ancient Greek philosophers, and of Isaac Newton, as it happens. The leading idea drawn from all this is that water must have a course to follow if floods are to be averted, and the genius of the original human managers of this problem was that they understood how water worked and created the pathways for it. And then the pathway of water, which created safe, level land for living, but also created irrigation and gave rise to agriculture. The idea of that pathway gave rise to the idea of the moral and social pathway of the Confucian philosopher, and also of the Taoist philosopher. The idea of flow was clearly fascinating. In Analects 9:17, we read, "The master, standing by a river, said, 'Isn't life's passing just like this, never ceasing day or night?'" It is a phrase reminiscent of the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who claimed that all is change, and that there is nothing but change. And in an effort to illustrate his idea, he spoke of a river, saying that we cannot step into the same river twice. It sounds as if Confucius saw a similar image of constant process when contemplating a river. There is in this myth of origin a story about the relationship of humankind and nature. The Genesis myth in the Bible tells a story about this too, in which there was a primeval paradise, a garden, and evil entered. The end of this story is that humankind is given dominion over the earth, and this suggests mastery, the relationship of struggle, and even an element of violence. The Chinese origin myth is similar in that it pits humankind against the elements in a kind of primeval struggle, and in this case, water is the enemy to be dealt with, and water is managed by the human race. But then, water is not actually an enemy. It is that which creates irrigation, agriculture, and nourishes human life, and that is equally part of the Chinese myth of origin. So the word enemy is the wrong word. Water is simply a given. It is nature, which has to be managed by humans, and the result of this management is harmony between the nature of water and the intelligence and industry of human beings. There is a difference between rainwater and water that comes from a spring, because the latter is ongoing and constant, whereas rainwater stops, and after a while the irrigation channels dry up. The Confucian philosophers drew upon these two types of water to explain two types of human being, in that some people are like water from a spring. They have ongoing and reliable characteristics and are people you can count on. But those who are like rainwater are at times rich and bountiful, but when the rainwater stops, they dry up, like the irrigation ditches, which figure so strongly in the Confucian tradition. I'm not sure that it's correct to refer to these moral lessons drawn from water as metaphor, in that metaphor refers to a merely symbolic relationship between the metaphor and the object or process described. But here we have a relationship which is not merely symbolic, but which is real. Water and humanity share a relationship with each other, and therefore it is natural to draw comparisons, because in fact they are like each other. And in this we are closer to the Greeks than we are to the Hebrews with the myth of Genesis. The Greek idea of analogy in philosophy is based on shared reality and the likeness or similarity of one part of reality to another. There is no metaphor, but only recognition of shared reality or recognition of likeness or similarity. So the unique quality of the Confucian discussion of water is that though it was the element against which there was an heroic struggle in the time of Yu, who created the watercourses and gave China the rivers, including the Yellow River, this was part of building a harmony between water and the human race, because they shared a destiny and they were part of each other. People often wonder about the attitude of the Confucian cultures towards climate change. And there seems to be a difference between East and West in this matter. The Confucian culture is confident that it is part of nature and lives in harmony with it, and that it will rise to the occasion, as did human beings in the mythical time of Yu. Western ideas are heavily anthropocentric, human-based, and involve a kind of human vanity about what human beings can do and have done. They involve the necessity for atonement and the idolatry of nature. All of these things are quite different from the Confucian image of humanity and nature walking hand in hand. Thank you for joining me, and next time we will talk more about the way of water.